Part 1. A year of unprecedented chaos. 2024 was not just another year. It was a tipping point. A year where global events collided in ways that were too stark, too interconnected, and too catastrophic to ignore. It felt as though the world was teetering on the edge of something monumental. At the center of this maelstrom was the continued invasion of Ukraine by Russia, an invasion that has dragged on for years and shown no signs of abating. This conflict is no longer just about land or sovereignty. It has become a quagmire of geopolitics, economic exploitation, and a grim reflection of the West's inability or unwillingness to act decisively. Billions of dollars have poured into Ukraine, ostensibly to help fend off Russian aggression. Yet these funds often feel like investments in prolonging the war rather than ending it. Western powers, led by the United States and its allies, have turned the conflict into a theater of profiteering. Defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, and private interests have all made fortunes, while ordinary Ukrainians and Russians have paid the price in blood. The narrative of democracy versus autocracy has been used to justify endless spending, but the reality is far murkier. War, as always, is good business, especially for those who never have to fight in it. The leadership vacuum in the United States. In the midst of this turmoil, the United States, the supposed leader of the free world, has been conspicuously absent in any meaningful capacity. President Joe Biden's administration has been marked by a level of detachment that borders on negligence. Biden himself seems more like a placeholder than a leader. His speeches punctuated by gaffes that would be amusing if they weren't coming from the man ostensibly in charge of the world's most powerful nation. And then there's Vice President Kamala Harris. Her lack of experience, combined with an apparent inability to grasp the gravity of the situations she's tasked with addressing, has left the administration rudderless. Her diplomatic efforts, particularly on the global stage, have ranged from ineffectual to downright embarrassing. In a world crying out for strong leadership, the United States has offered little more than empty platitudes and incoherent policies. This lack of leadership has had profound consequences. The botched withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, which marked the beginning of this administration's tenure, set the tone for the years that followed. By 2024, the aftershocks of that disaster were still being felt. The Taliban, now firmly in control of Afghanistan, have emboldened extremists across the region. Terrorist networks that had been subdued are resurging, while the United States seems either unwilling or unable to respond effectively. The administration's failure to address the Israel-Gaza conflict is another glaring example. This year has seen the violence escalate to unprecedented levels, with Iran playing puppet master in a proxy war that has destabilized the region further. Iranian-backed groups like Hezbollah have launched attacks with increasing frequency, while Israel retaliates with devastating force. The result is a cycle of violence that shows no signs of abating. And where is the United States? Nowhere to be found. Iran, emboldened by this power vacuum, has expanded its influence across the Middle East. Its nuclear ambitions, once a point of contention, are now treated with a resigned shrug. Sanctions and diplomacy have done little to curb Tehran's aggression. If anything, they've only reinforced the perception that the West is weak and divided. The growing threat of China. While the Middle East burns and Europe falters, China has been quietly, and not so quietly, asserting itself on the global stage. Beijing's ambitions are no longer confined to rhetoric or soft power. They are manifesting in military drills, economic coercion, and open threats. Taiwan remains the flashpoint, and 2024 saw tensions escalate to levels unseen in decades. Chinese warships patrol the Taiwan Strait with increasing frequency, and its Air Force conducts near-daily incursions into Taiwanese airspace. The Biden administration's response has been predictably underwhelming. Economic sanctions and strongly worded statements have done little to deter Xi Jinping, who sees them as empty gestures. The Chinese Communist Party has long viewed the West as decadent and declining, and 2024 has done nothing to dissuade them of that notion. In their eyes, this is the moment to strike, to reshape the global order in their image. It's not just Taiwan that's at risk. China's Belt and Road Initiative has entrenched its influence across Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe. Countries indebted to Beijing are finding themselves increasingly at its mercy. while the West watches from the sidelines. If this isn't a new Cold War, it's something very close to it. And the United States, once the counterweight to Chinese expansion, now seems too distracted and divided to mount a serious challenge. The European crisis. The situation in Europe is equally dire. The European Union and the United Kingdom have spent much of 2024 grappling with waves of uncontrolled immigration. This isn't a new issue, but the scale and speed of the crisis have overwhelmed even the most prepared nations. Germany, France, Italy, and the UK have all seen unprecedented levels of migration, driven by conflicts in Africa and the Middle East, as well as economic instability in parts of Asia. The consequences have been devastating. Social services are stretched to the breaking point, crime rates are rising, and the native populations are increasingly resentful. This isn't about xenophobia or racism, it's about governments failing to manage the situation. The result has been a surge in far-right sentiment across Europe, with protests and riots becoming regular occurrences. Germany, once the economic powerhouse of Europe, has been hit particularly hard. A terrorist attack at a Christmas market in Berlin in late 2024 sent shockwaves through the country. The attacker, an asylum seeker with ties to extremist groups, reignited debates about immigration policy and border control. The incident was a stark reminder that the consequences of uncontrolled migration aren't just economic, they're existential. In the UK, the Southport incident, a violent clash between locals and immigrant groups, sparked nationwide protests. These weren't isolated events, they were the culmination of years of frustration boiling over. The protests quickly turned ugly, with clashes between demonstrators and police, as well as between rival factions within the protests themselves. The government's response has been tepid, at best, and the country feels more divided than ever. A deliberate plan or incompetence? As these events unfold, one can't help but wonder, is this all part of a larger plan? Is the chaos we're witnessing a calculated attack on the West's ideology, freedoms, and way of life? Or is it simply the inevitable result of weak leadership, poor governance, and fractured societies? The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between, but the patterns are hard to ignore. The mass migration into Europe, the rise of extremism, the economic pressures, and the erosion of freedoms all feel too coordinated to be mere coincidence. Some have suggested that this is part of a deliberate strategy, an effort to destabilize Western democracies and pave the way for a new global order. Whether or not that's true, the outcome is the same. The West is weaker, more divided, and less capable of responding to threats than it has been in decades. The events of 2024 don't feel like random occurrences. They feel like the prelude to something much bigger. History has shown us that periods of chaos often precede major conflicts, and right now, it feels like we're hurtling toward another chapter in the human meat grinder of war. Are we ready for what's coming? Or are we sleepwalking into disaster?